Let's look at the required elements of a research report. You have title, abstract, intro, method, results, discussion, and the references. This course uses APA style. You can always find up-to-date guidelines for APA formatting and citations by Google searching APA OWL, which links to the library at Purdue University. The search words for MLA OWL or Chicago OWL is what you need to convert to those citation styles. But quantitative communication research almost always adheres to APA style. Here's a screenshot of a check sheet for the various elements of a research article that is quantitative or empirical based. The first item is the title. Any variables considered major should be identified in the title. You also need to identify the appropriate relationship among those variables. So is it the effect of, the relationship between, or the difference between groups based on some variable, where a group would be the independent variable and the outcome variable would be your dependent variable. Is the scope specified? That is it narrowed down towards just one age population or in one setting? A lot of times students confuse the word scope with variable. So they'll say, well, I'm looking at the effect of social media, but social media is more of a scope than it is a variable. If you're talking about frequency of social media use, then it's a variable. If you're just talking about social media in general, it's a scope. The title should be consistent with the article's hypotheses, research questions, or purpose, and there should be no unnecessary words. As I record this, the world has changed since I got this checklist, and a lot of researchers feel compelled to put extra words in a title separated by a colon to make it longer and maybe more entertaining. But really it should just be about the variables. Second part of a research report is the abstract. The function of an abstract is to help the reader decide whether to read the article. Everything in the research report should be stated in the abstract. What was the hypothesis, or what were the research questions? You have to spell out the size of the sample. You need to identify any tools you use, like a survey, if it's a particular instrument. A lot of times students think instrument is something special. An instrument is like a survey. If an experiment is used, the experimental design should be identified. And most importantly, the results should be stated. It's not the case to tease people into reading the article by saying many interesting findings were revealed. Say what the findings were. Give the ending. And of course, they should be brief. So usually 100 words, sometimes 150 words is plenty. The introduction is a little more complicated. You have a couple of functions here. You have a couple of tasks to take care of. You need to frame the context of the problem. You have to identify what the problem is and that it's been documented that it is an issue. You need to reveal what we know so far. That includes putting together some background information, referencing it to previous studies, and providing a justification for why you're doing this study. As with anything, it should be logically organized, and you should not overlook any variables in the background that are going to be revealed in the next part of the introduction, which is a statement of the research hypothesis or the research question. A research question is fine. If you're working on a lot of previous research, you should be able to have a hypothesis, which is an expectation of an outcome. But if there hasn't been much research done, then you can frame it as a question, like what do we need to know? It has to be presented, it has to indicate the variables of interest, and it needs to indicate the relationship among the variables to be investigated, which relates back to the title of the article. And the hypothesis or research question should logically flow from the first part of the introduction. So none of the research questions should surprise the reader. And of course, the questions need to be testable. and need to be stated so that you can collect data to demonstrate a relationship among the variables. There are 3, sometimes 4 parts to the methods section. You need to describe the procedures for sampling. You need to give the size and major characteristics of the sample, which would include a mean, standard deviation, and a range of numbers for each variable. And the sample size has to be appropriate for your study. Now, for student projects, the sample size can be small. In this class, you're not expected to do this for publication, but you should aim appropriately high. The second part of the methods section is what was your instrumentation? What did you use? Did you use a survey? Did you do a content analysis? It's not so important to me that you present evidence of validity and reliability at this point. However, if you use a series of questions that are related to each other, you need to report Cronbach's alpha, and I'll explain that in a separate lecture. If you're using an existing survey or an existing instrument, you need to cite it. And by the way, it's easier to use someone else's idea and cite it than it is to cook one up all by yourself. In fact, your results are more credible if you use an existing survey or an existing model for communication. The next section of the methods is only if you're doing an experiment. So the elements of the treatment are reserved for experiments, and many of you will not be doing that. The usual third part of the methods are your data collection procedures. You need to provide sufficient detail to permit replication so that if anybody else comes along, they can see how you did it and they can follow along, like a recipe. For student projects, it may be as simple as saying, I sent the survey to friends and family and they filled it out. And this was a convenience sample. The next major section of a research report is the results section. It should follow the research questions. Maybe you only had one research question. The results section should specify which statistical tests were done. They should be labeled correctly. If you're doing a quantitative study, you have to present numbers in your results section. And one of those elements is a statistic. For example, an F-test, or a T-test, or a chi-square test, or a Pearson's R correlation, or a regression statistic. I'm not too interested in tables and figures for this class. Results should be presented in a clear and logical manner because you're trying to persuade the reader that you did or did not answer the research question, and were the findings statistically significant or not. That's the purpose of the results section. You should not discuss why you think it worked or didn't work in the results section. That's for the next section, the discussion section. And in the discussion section, there's roughly 3 parts. One is you say again what you found. Usually you lead with the most important finding and how that relates to your research question or hypothesis, and that you have substantial evidence. And do you correctly interpret the results? Maybe you should address why this is important at this point. You're kind of coming full circle on the issues you discussed in the introduction of the paper. And then final are some recommendations and a statement of limitations. You can devote a paragraph to this study is limited by only having 50 participants, or this study was limited because it used a convenience sample. Don't beat yourself up about limitations. Just state them matter of fact and quickly in a separate paragraph. Ending the paper is just as difficult as ending an essay you might have written for an English literature class. In order to get out of a research study, the easiest way is to call for future research on variables that you did not look at, or in situations you didn't look for, or some other call for future research. The references section is what you may have come to learn as the Works Cited page. Works Cited is for MLA. In APA style, it's called references. And you need to follow the guidelines on the Purdue University website, which I mentioned above. And then there's some style guidelines. use appropriate English, use appropriate structure, and try to be unbiased in your reporting style, which may require you to use the passive voice. And it may require you to sound dull and listless. But believe me, if a paper is too chummy, entertaining, uses the word I and we way too much, or uses the second person pronouns you too much, it looks more like an article written for a student newspaper than for a research journal. So you need to keep it very serious and dull. And you will be more persuasive being dull than you will be being entertaining.